Mark Evans grew up in a small suburban town that seemed to stand still in time. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the streets were lined with rows of identical houses. Nothing ever seemed out of place. Nothing, that is, except for Mark's own family. Mark's family was far from ordinary. There was his mother, Linda Evans, who always wore a smile even when the weight of the world seemed to press on her shoulders. There was his father, Henry Evans, a quiet man who worked long hours as an accountant, always coming home tired but never without a warm greeting for his children. Then there was his older brother, Ethan Evans, the one who everyone adored, including their parents. Ethan was everything Mark was not: outgoing, charming, and always surrounded by a circle of friends. From a young age, Ethan was the center of attention, his quick wit and magnetic personality drawing people in. He could convince anyone to do anything, from helping him with homework to lending him money. Mark, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the serious one. He preferred the company of books and computers, his mind always preoccupied with questions and theories that often seemed out of reach for others. Growing up in Ethan's shadow wasn't easy for Mark. It wasn't just that his brother was popular, it was the way Ethan always made him feel small. Ethan had a way of belittling Mark, of reminding him that he was the better one. Their rivalry went beyond sibling disagreements. It was a constant game of one-upmanship, with Mark always coming in second. But there was something more lurking beneath the surface of their relationship. Mark had always suspected that Ethan wasn't as perfect as he seemed. They were hints, little details that didn't add up. The way Ethan's charm could turn to cold indifference in an instant, the way he seemed to slip out of trouble no matter what he did. But Mark pushed those thoughts aside. He couldn't confront them, not yet. It wasn't until the night of their high school graduation that everything began to unravel. The night before graduation, Mark was sitting at his desk, trying to cram for the final exams that would determine his future. He had always been the studious one, the one who took his responsibilities seriously. But as he stared at the pages in front of him, his mind kept wandering back to Ethan. It wasn't just the usual sibling rivalry anymore, something was different. Ethan had been acting strange lately, distant and secretive, like there was something he was hiding. That's when Ethan knocked on his door. "Mark, can I talk to you for a minute?" Ethan's voice was unusually serious. Mark looked up from his books, surprised. Ethan never came to him for advice or help, he had always been the one who others turned to. "What's up?" Ethan hesitated before stepping inside, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "I need you to do something for me," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark's eyebrows furrowed. "What is it?" Ethan closed the door behind him, his face suddenly etched with a kind of urgency Mark had never seen before. "I've gotten myself into some trouble, and I need your help." Mark leaned back in his chair, skeptical. "What kind of trouble?" Ethan's gaze flicked to the window, as though checking for eavesdroppers. It's complicated. But I need you to keep quiet about it. Just pretend you don't know anything. If anyone asks, you don't know what's going on." Mark's heart began to race. "What are you talking about? What did you get yourself into?" Ethan took a deep breath, as though weighing his options. Finally, he spoke. "I've borrowed money from some dangerous people. And they want it back now." Mark's mind raced. He knew his brother had been involved in some questionable activities, gambling, loans, high-stakes bets, but this sounded different. Dangerous, even. "What do you mean, dangerous people?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "Who are these people, Ethan?" Ethan's eyes hardened. "People who don't take kindly to being ignored. People who will do whatever it takes to get their money back. And they know about you, Mark. They know about Mom and Dad. If I go down, they'll come for all of us." Mark's stomach twisted into knots. "So what do you want me to do?" "I just need you to stay quiet. Help me figure this out, and everything will go back to normal." Mark stared at his brother, his mind racing. This was the kind of trouble that didn't go away easily. It was the kind of trouble that dragged everyone down with it. But despite his better judgment, Mark agreed. He felt a mixture of fear and loyalty. Ethan was his brother, after all. And family meant everything to Mark, even if it meant getting tangled in Ethan's web of lies and deception. The days following the conversation were a blur. Mark tried to go about his normal routine, focusing on his studies, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface. Ethan's warnings haunted him, and his paranoia grew as the days passed. It wasn't until the night of their graduation party that things started to spiral out of control. Mark had tried to ignore the tension that had been building between him and Ethan, but it was impossible to avoid. The night was supposed to be a celebration of their accomplishments, but as Mark entered the crowded living room of their family's house, he could feel the weight of his brother's presence, dark, looming, like a shadow that refused to leave. As the night wore on, Ethan's behavior grew more erratic. He was drunk, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Mark couldn't help but notice the way Ethan kept checking his phone, his fingers tapping nervously on the screen. It was clear that something was wrong, but Mark couldn't figure out what it was. That's when the doorbell rang. The sudden sound sent a chill down Mark's spine. It was late, too late for visitors. But when Ethan rushed to answer the door, Mark followed him, his heart pounding in his chest. A man stood in the doorway, tall and imposing, wearing a dark suit and a pair of dark sunglasses that hid his eyes. His presence alone sent a wave of fear through Mark. "Is this the Evans residence?" the man asked, his voice cold and menacing. Ethan nodded quickly. "Yeah. What do you want?" The man's lips curled into a sinister smile. "I believe you have something that belongs to us." Mark's stomach sank as he watched the interaction unfold. His brother's debt had come to collect, and Mark was about to find out just how far Ethan had gone to get himself into this mess. The next few days were a blur of panic and uncertainty. Ethan disappeared, leaving behind only a trail of broken promises and unanswered questions. Mark didn't know where to turn or who to trust. His brother had gone off the grid, leaving Mark to face the consequences of his actions. And then there was Sophia, Mark's girlfriend, the one person he thought he could rely on. But even she seemed distant. There were nights when Mark would call her, only to be met with vague excuses and half-hearted assurances. It wasn't long before he began to suspect that Sophia knew more than she was letting on. It was one night, as Mark scrolled through his phone, that the truth finally hit him like a ton of bricks. Sophia had been in contact with the same people who had come to their house. She had known about Ethan's dealings with the criminal underworld from the very beginning. But she hadn't told Mark. She had kept him in the dark, knowing full well that if he ever found out, it would tear everything apart. And it did. Mark confronted Sophia the next day, his mind racing with fury and betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. "Why didn't you warn me?" Sophia's face fell, her eyes filled with regret. "I didn't want you to get involved. I didn't want to put you in danger." But it was too late for that. Mark had already been pulled into the mess, and now there was no way out. The stakes had never been higher. Mark's life was unraveling at an alarming rate. His brother was gone, his girlfriend had betrayed him, and the people who had been chasing Ethan were now after him. But Mark was no longer the quiet, reserved man he once was. He had changed. The betrayals had hardened him, turned him into someone he didn't recognize. The time for running was over. It was time to confront the people who had caused this chaos, to put an end to the lies. With the help of a private investigator, Mark uncovered the truth about Ethan's dealings. Ethan had been running an underground gambling ring, but it wasn't just that. He had made connections with powerful people who had ties to organized crime. People who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Mark didn't know what he was walking into, but he was prepared to face whatever came next. The night of the final confrontation arrived. Mark stood in front of a dilapidated building on the edge of town, the same place where Ethan had disappeared. He didn't know what to expect, only that it was time to end this nightmare. He stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest, knowing that whatever happened next would change his life forever. Mark stepped cautiously into the dimly lit building, his breath coming in shallow bursts as his eyes adjusted to the gloom. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and dust. The sound of his footsteps echoed unnervingly in the hollow silence, as though the building itself was holding its breath. The place was a former warehouse, abandoned for years, forgotten by most but still alive with secrets. He had learned from the investigator that this was where Ethan had gone to make his deals, where he had made himself indispensable to the people who were now hunting Mark down. With each step, Mark's mind raced. He couldn't help but wonder if Ethan was still alive, if he would ever get the chance to confront him. The phone calls had stopped, and Ethan had disappeared completely. It was as though he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but destruction in his wake. As Mark reached the heart of the building, he noticed movement in the shadows. Figures in dark clothing stood silently, watching him approach. One of them stepped forward, a tall, muscular man with a scar running down his cheek, his eyes as cold as steel. "You must be Mark Evans," the man said, his voice rough, as though he'd been speaking through a throat full of broken glass. "I've been waiting for you." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea who this man was, but the tension in the air was enough to make his skin crawl. "Where's my brother?" Mark demanded, his voice shaking but steady. The man's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Ethan? He's not coming back. Not unless he's ready to pay what he owes." Mark's fists clenched. "What did he do?" The man chuckled darkly, taking a step closer. "He's been playing with fire for a long time, Mark. Borrowing money from people he shouldn't have, gambling with his life. But the real problem? He got greedy. And now, you get to clean up his mess." Mark's eyes narrowed. "I'm not here to clean up anyone's mess. I'm here to end this." The man laughed again, louder this time, as though Mark had just cracked a joke. "You think you're going to walk out of here, kid? You think you're just going to waltz in and make demands?" The man took a step forward, his posture threatening. "You're in over your head." Before Mark could react, the building's door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the empty room. Several more figures emerged from the shadows, circling him like wolves closing in on their prey. Mark's pulse was racing. He had been trained to think quickly, to solve problems under pressure, but this was beyond anything he had ever faced before. He was surrounded, trapped, with no escape. His mind raced for a solution, but it was hard to think straight with the weight of his brother's actions bearing down on him. The man with the scar stepped forward, holding out a piece of paper. "This is a contract. Your brother signed it, agreeing to work for us, no questions asked. You're his family, and that makes you responsible for his debts." Mark's stomach twisted. A contract? He had no idea what Ethan had signed up for, but from the looks of it, it was more than just money. It was his soul on the line. "I'm not signing anything," Mark said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. "I didn't make this mess. Ethan did. So if you want him, go after him." The man smiled, a slow, deliberate grin. "Oh, we already did. But Ethan's not coming back. You, on the other hand, can take his place. If you don't, we'll make sure your family pays the price. All of them." Mark's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about him, it was about his parents, his friends, everyone he cared about. His life was no longer his own. It was a game of survival, and if he didn't play by their rules, they would destroy everything. He had no choice. "I'll do it," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you have to promise that you'll leave my family alone." The man's eyes glinted with amusement. "Oh, we'll leave them alone. As long as you do exactly as we say." Mark's heart sank. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Mark found himself dragged deeper into Ethan's world. He was forced to make choices that no one should have to make, decisions that stripped away his humanity piece by piece. The people who had taken control of his life weren't just criminals, they were ruthless. Cold. They had no regard for anyone or anything. Mark was expected to do their bidding without question, no matter how vile the task. Every day felt like a battle for his soul. He had become a pawn in a game he didn't understand, surrounded by enemies he couldn't see. But with every task, every favor he was forced to fulfill, Mark's resolve grew stronger. He wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to let his brother's mistakes be his burden for the rest of his life. He would find a way out. He had to. It wasn't long before Mark discovered something that would change everything. One night, after completing a job that left him physically and emotionally drained, Mark uncovered a hidden ledger in the back of the building. It was a record of everything, every deal, every illegal transaction, and most importantly, the names of the people behind it all. This was the leverage Mark had been waiting for. With this information, Mark knew he could destroy the criminal organization once and for all. But there was a catch. There was no way to get out without taking someone down. Someone big. Someone dangerous. He made a decision. Mark made his move. He contacted the authorities, working in the shadows to ensure that the criminal syndicate would fall. It was a delicate operation, but Mark was determined. He was no longer the scared, vulnerable man who had walked into that building weeks ago. He was a man with a purpose, a man who would fight for his life, for his family, and for justice. But there was a final twist in the story that no one could have predicted. The authorities raided the warehouse, and the criminal syndicate was dismantled piece by piece. Mark's brother, Ethan, was found. He had been hiding in plain sight, working with the very people who had threatened to destroy Mark's life. But Ethan wasn't the same person Mark had once known. He had changed, just as Mark had. In the end, Mark had to make a choice. He could expose Ethan for the lies and betrayal he had caused, or he could protect him and give him a second chance. But Ethan, standing in the shadows, made it clear that he wasn't the person Mark had once thought him to be. "Mark," Ethan said, his voice cold and detached. "You've won. But at what cost? You're just like me now. There's no going back." Mark stared at his brother, the weight of everything they had been through crashing down on him. He didn't respond. There was no need to. His actions had spoken for him. This was the end of the road. It was time for closure. As Ethan was taken away, Mark turned his back, walking away from the life he had known. There would be no easy answers, no happy endings. But one thing was certain, Mark Evans had survived. Mark's life would never be the same. The shadows of the past would always follow him, but he had learned to live with the scars. The betrayal. The lies. The darkness. He had faced it all and come out stronger on the other side. But he would never forget the lesson he had learned. Sometimes, the cost of survival is far greater than anyone could ever imagine. And sometimes, the only way out is to burn everything to the ground. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Mark stood at the edge of the rooftop, his heart pounding as he looked down at the scene unfolding below. Police cars had swarmed the area, and the criminal syndicate was being taken down one by one. It was the moment Mark had been waiting for, but it came with a bittersweet taste. Ethan. His brother. The person who had dragged him into this nightmare in the first place. He stood behind Mark now, a ghost of the person he had once been. "You did it, didn't you?" Ethan's voice was distant, almost hollow. "You took them down. But you've become just like them. You know that, right?" Mark didn't turn around. His eyes were fixed on the scene below. "I didn't have a choice, Ethan," he said, his voice strained. "You made me do this." Ethan's laughter was hollow, devoid of humor. "No, Mark. You always had a choice. You just chose to become a part of it. You're no better than me now." Mark's hands clenched into fists. He could feel the weight of everything he had done pressing down on him, but he wasn't going to let his brother's words break him. Not this time. "You're wrong," Mark said quietly, his eyes cold. "I did what I had to do to survive. But you've always been a coward. Hiding behind your lies, your manipulation. I'm done with you." Ethan took a step forward, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "You think you're better than me now, don't you? You think you're some kind of hero, but you're not. You're just as lost as I am." Mark's chest tightened, but he held his ground. He wasn't going to let Ethan drag him down with him. Not anymore. "I'm not lost," Mark said firmly. "I found my way out. And I'm never going back to the person I was before. You'll always be trapped in this darkness, Ethan. And that's on you." For a moment, there was silence between them. Mark could feel the weight of their shared history hanging in the air like a storm about to break. But then, a voice cut through the tension. "Mark." Mark turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the figure approaching him from the shadows. It was the same man who had confronted him in the warehouse, the leader of the syndicate, the one who had pulled the strings behind everything. "You did well," the man said, his eyes gleaming with approval. "You've taken down the others. Now, it's time to finish what you started." Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had hoped this moment wouldn't come. He had hoped he could walk away, free from the life he had been thrust into. But the man's words were a reminder that no one walked away unscathed from this world. Mark squared his shoulders, facing the man with newfound determination. "I'm done," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not working for you anymore. I'm not your puppet." The man's lips curled into a sinister smile. "You think it's that easy? You think you can just walk away from this?" He took a step closer, his presence imposing. "No one leaves the game, Mark. No one." Mark's hands trembled, but his resolve was unshakable. He had already lost everything. He wasn't going to lose his soul. "I'm not afraid of you," Mark said, his voice low but resolute. The man's smile faltered, and for a brief moment, Mark saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But then, the man's expression hardened, and he stepped forward. "You'll be," he said, his voice cold as ice. Just then, a gunshot rang out. The man's eyes widened in shock as he collapsed to the ground, a pool of blood spreading around him. Mark turned to see Ethan standing behind him, a smoking gun in his hand. "I told you, Mark," Ethan said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "No one walks away. Not without blood on their hands." Mark stared at his brother, his heart racing. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Ethan to take action. But now that he had, Mark wasn't sure if he should feel grateful, or terrified. Ethan dropped the gun to the ground, his expression unreadable. "I did this for you, Mark. To keep you alive." Mark took a step back, his mind reeling. This wasn't the brother he had known. This was someone else, someone darker, someone who had become a part of the world Mark had fought so hard to escape. "No," Mark said firmly. "You did it for yourself. You always do. You'll never change." Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as the police began to close in on the building. Mark stood there, his heart heavy, watching his brother fade into the night. The police arrived in full force, securing the area and apprehending the remaining members of the syndicate. Mark watched from the rooftop, his mind numb from the events that had just unfolded. He had never imagined that it would end like this. His brother, a man he had once looked up to, had become a monster, just like the ones they had both tried to escape. But Mark wasn't going to let that be the end of his story. He was done with the lies, the manipulation, and the bloodshed. He had lost enough. It was time to move on, to start over. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the city, Mark took one last look at the scene below. The chaos. The destruction. The price of survival. He knew it was over. Mark turned and walked away from the rooftop, his steps steady, his heart a little lighter. The world was a dangerous place, but he had learned how to survive. And that was all that mattered now. Mark left the city behind, disappearing into the unknown. He knew that the past would always haunt him, that the choices he had made would never be fully erased. But he had learned something important in the process. Redemption wasn't about forgetting. It was about moving forward. As he walked down the quiet road, his thoughts drifted to his parents, to the people he loved. He would rebuild. He would make things right. One step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, Mark Evans felt like he was free. If you enjoyed this thrilling journey, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on the latest content. Share this story with your friends, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay tuned for more suspenseful adventures.